Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents On Operations, Operational Art and Military Disciplines by B.A. Friedman. Narrated by Dysart. Preface. This book, like my previous book, is Clausewitzian. By that, I mean that it falls within a framework of what warfare, strategy, and tactics are as a phenomenon as described by Karl von Clausewitz, 1780 to 1831. Olivia Gerard, rhyming with Alfred North Whitehead, has said that all strategic theory is a series of footnotes to Clausewitz. I would instead say that all good strategic theory is a series of footnotes to Clausewitz. Good footnotes to Clausewitz is all I hope these books to be. If you are looking for something non-Clausewitzian, this is not it. There are certainly publications that can provide that, but I do not recommend any of them. This volume would still be a formless jumble of notes were it not for my wife, Ashton, whose comment triggered the chapter that really ties the whole book together. During one conversation, Colonel Doug King, U.S. Marine Corps, retired, said one sentence that clarified all my thinking about the command and control chapter. Control is what the staff does. I have a lot to thank Doug King for, but this is the one most relevant for this book. Captain Wayne Hughes, U.S. Navy, retired, greatly influenced my previous book, On Tactics, A Theory of Victory in Battle, 2017. And generously shared his experience and knowledge with me as I worked through the manuscript for that volume. He was also instrumental in its acceptance for publication. In December 2019, he passed away. His influence will live on in the naval and strategic theory communities, and I remain grateful for his guidance. Fair winds and following seas. Conversations with colleagues have sharpened the ideas contained herein on a number of occasions, especially those with Lieutenant Colonel Gregory Wardman, U.S. Marine Corps retired, and Captain Olivia Gerard, U.S. Marine Corps. Olivia especially helped me think through the campaign taxonomy, while Greg considerably shaped my thoughts on the information discipline. I owe them both a debt of gratitude. David Allman pointed me in the direction of motivator hygiene theory, which strengthened the chapter on administration. There are two weaknesses in this book, I believe. One is an unfortunate focus on so-called Western history and thought. This is a function both of the paucity of sources readily available to an independent writer such as myself, and the fact that the operational level of war is a fundamentally Western concept. So, while the operational art of the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, of modern China is an interesting subject, its discussion is excluded from the following chapters. Briefly, however, current PLA thought has what might be described as four levels: military thought, Junshi Xishan; military strategy, Zanlue; campaigns, Zanyi; and tactics, Zanshu. Nonetheless, these concepts do not exactly map to Western conceptions of the operational level or operational art, which is the focus of this book. Western writers sometimes conflate campaigns, joint warfare, and the operational level when describing PLA ideas, but this is a misunderstanding of U.S. doctrine and an assumption about Chinese thought. For example, the Western operational level of war is sometimes depicted as the ways part of an ends, ways, means formulation of strategy. But the ways of this construct is more similar to the Chinese idea of strategic mean, Zanlue Shudan, than to the operational level. Works in English that connect Western, especially American, doctrinal concepts with PLA doctrinal concepts as direct equivalents should be viewed with extreme skepticism. The Chinese do not have a military doctrine as it is understood in Western militaries, but rather a unique style of military regulation that precludes easy comparison. Those interested in the PLA especially should see M. Taylor Fravel, Active Defense, Chinese Military Strategy since 1949, published in 2019. The other weakness herein is an excessive focus on land warfare. This is a function entirely of my own shortcomings and background when it comes to aviation and naval operations. I have made an attempt to include more on those subjects than I did in my previous book, but the attention is still far less than they deserve. This book, like the last, is not a work of history, but one of theory. It uses history extensively for evidence and explanation to support the theory, but is not intended to be a work of history. It therefore relies mostly on secondary sources. Primary sources in the form of doctrinal manuals and, in one case, a discussion between myself and an author of doctrinal manuals were used. But secondary sources necessarily underpin the development of the theory itself. If there is any one takeaway from this book and on tactics, it's that there is no one route to victory in war. There are too many factors that come into play, and theory is at its best when it helps one think about those factors without trying to prescribe solutions. Where I prescribe solutions, they address organizational issues. Hopefully, that is what this book is, a tool for greater clarity. I hesitate to say that I am following in Clausewitz's footsteps except in one respect, that he railed against the purveyors of shallow prescriptions, salesmen promising success if only the proper rules and guides are followed. There are no new rules of war, just as there were no old ones. There are no guarantees and no certainties. There are definitely no simple answers. Anyone saying otherwise is selling snake oil. Unfortunately, there is far too much of that in the defense world today, growing and accumulating on the U.S. military especially, like plague. Some of it comes from academia, some of it from the political punditry rackets on the right and left. Some of it, like the operational level of war, grows from misunderstandings within the U.S. military itself. But all war is subject to probabilities, so there is no way to know whether or not my attack on this particular misunderstanding will be as successful as Clausewitz's was. The only way to know is to launch it. Introduction. A revolution is an idea that has found its bayonets. Napoleon Bonaparte. Regarding the general staff system that first sprang up in Prussia and then spread throughout Europe and the world, Sir Michael Howard writes, "This general staff was perhaps the great military innovation of the 19th century." On Operations argues that Howard was correct and that general staffs were developed to cope with the expanding complexity and scale of modern warfare since the Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815. At the same time, another coping mechanism was the invention of the operational level of war, a concept that is, this book argues, problematic at best and ruinous at worst. In contrast, operational art, a sister concept, is useful as a descriptor of what military staffs do to support and sustain tactics in the pursuit of strategy. The operational art performed by staffs is best described in theory as a set of disciplines, commonly known as warfighting functions. The military success usually attributed, wrongly, to the discovery of an operational level of war should instead be credited to the rise of general staffs. This adoption of the operational level by Western militaries especially has amputated tactics from strategy, with tragic effect, and blinded those militaries from effectively instituting military staffs. My previous book, on tactics, focused on the commanders of military units who are responsible for employing force against an opposing military force. Commanders are necessarily tacticians. On Operations focuses on staff officers who support those commanders by performing the functions of operational art. While tactical acumen is certainly desirable and useful to any staff officer, these people do not perform tactics. This also applies to major subordinate commands of a unit, whose own staffs perform operational art at their level. The operational level of war. Although the invention of the operational level of war is usually credited to the Red Army of the Soviet Union, this is a myth. The Soviets began using the term operations and operational art to refer to the increasing complexity of planning military operations, and perhaps also as a way of discussing strategy without the risk of voicing ideas contrary to those of founder Vladimir Lenin, who fancied himself a strategist. Lenin's view of strategy was permeated with politics. In a speech in 1917, he claimed, "It seems to me that the most important thing that is usually overlooked in the question of the war is the question of the class character of the war. What caused that war? What classes are waging it? And what historical and historico-economic conditions gave rise to it?" He went on to quote Clausewitz, of whom he was a devotee, but twists the meaning of the Clausewitzian view of war as a political contest to one of class struggle. "War is a continuation of policy by other means. All wars are inseparable from the political systems that engender them. The policy which a given state, a given class within that state, pursued for a long time before the war is inevitably continued by that same class during the war, the form of action alone being changed." Strategy was spoken for in the Soviet system. Joseph Stalin assumed the mantle of master strategist from Lenin, and operational art became the safe space in which Soviet officers could discuss their trade. Sometime thereafter, when these ideas and terms spread to other military forces, the concept morphed into the idea of an operational level. Be that as it may, warfare was indeed becoming more complex as a result of the Industrial Revolution, and the idea of an operational level of war was a possible way to cope with that expanding intricacy. While warfare has always been complex, after the Industrial Revolution, the sustainable size of armies increased, as did their rates of fire, effective range, and movement. The complexity of weapon systems increased, causing a concomitant expansion of all manner of sustainment, spare parts, fuel, oil, and the level of training and expertise required by service members. The Russian army was directly presented with this complexity, not just due to the fact that they were defeated by Germany in World War I, 1914 through 1918, and then immediately fought a civil war, but also during the latter they had to build a new military from scratch, and along Marxist-Leninist ideological lines as well. These two aspects of the concept, that it was a response to Marxist-Leninist requirements and the complexity of industrial warfare, remain its most solid distinguishing characteristics even today. Proponents of the operational level of war view it as a politics-free zone where commanders could demonstrate their mastery of managing large forces over wide areas in a series of complex engagements. Its relationship to strategy and tactics is hierarchical. Strategy passes down objectives or goals to the operational level, which further passes them down to the tactical level. At times, it has been viewed as grand tactics, at other times as closer to strategy. Its apolitical and complex nature, however, has remained constant, even though the concept quickly devolved into competing sets of definitions. Some have defined it as a level of command, such as the corps levels and above. Others have simply used scale, as in the numbers of men and amount of material involved, as well as the distance over which military forces could travel. Still others have focused on its function. For example, Jim Storr has described it thus: "Operational art is the link. It concerns the planning, sequencing, resourcing, and conducting a series of battles or tactics within a theater in order to achieve the strategic objectives of the campaign." Yet he also refers to it as a level of command above the division. Still elsewhere in the same book, the operational level is defined by large units and very large distances. Almost all proponents peg the emergence of the operational level to changes in warfare sometime during the decades between the Napoleonic Wars and World War II, 1939 to 1945. There were indeed many changes during this period, and Chapter 2 argues that modern war began with the Napoleonic Wars. But the idea of an operational level poorly captures the changes and dynamics that led modernity. Robert M. Epstein, professor at the U.S. Army School of Military Studies and one of the originators of the concept, sees the emergence of an operational level during the Napoleonic Wars. He describes operational campaigns as characterized by symmetrical conscript armies, organized into corps, maneuvered in a distributed fashion so that tactical engagements are sequenced and often simultaneous. Command is decentralized, yet the commanders have a common understanding of operations methods. Victory is achieved by the cumulative effects of tactical engagements and operational campaigns. This is as solid a description of the operational level as can be found, since it accounts for all the aspects generally attributed to the concept: scale, maneuvered in a distributed fashion; command level, the use of corps and decentralized command; doctrine, common operational methods; and the linking of tactics across time, sequenced into cumulative effects. The problem is that none of the aspects in this description was new to the Napoleonic Wars. Every one of them occurred well before, sometimes centuries before the time when Epstein claims they emerged, and were not even new in European history. The identified attributes are also aspects of, to highlight only major conflicts in Europe, the Peloponnesian Wars, 431 to 405 BC, the Second Punic War, 218 to 202 BC, the Gallic Wars, 58 to 50 BC, the Roman Civil War, 49 to 45 BC, the Arab Conquests, AD 622 to 750, the Mongol Conquest, AD 1237 to 1291, the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, AD 1756 to 1763, and the American War for Independence, AD 1775 to 1783. The only exception is the use of the word corps to describe units of that size. But corps-sized organizations were certainly used prior to that point, as was the articulation inherent in the corps system. The emergence of a new level based on the presence of ancient characteristics is patently absurd. As we shall see, this conceptual inconsistency is common across the literature on the operational level of war, even among its supposed inventors, the Red Army. This is not solely a problem of definition, it is a problem with the concept itself. The operational level of war cannot find solid purchase as an idea because there is simply no logical space for it. The parameters described before are frequently cited interchangeably, but never is the logic of the operational level of war addressed. The classic definitions of tactics and strategy, those descended from Clausewitz's On War, focus on their logic. What distinguishes them is not level of command, scale, size, or even complexity. Rather, it is their logic that made the difference for Clausewitz. The logic of tactics is to gain battlefield victory. The logic of strategy is to use those victories for the purpose of the war. The first is linear, the second is nonlinear. These definitions leave no logical space for an operational level of war, no matter how big the operation. They have linear logic, defeat the opponent, and therefore have the same logic as tactics. As soon as the operational level moves closer to strategy, politics and strategic effect become involved, and the nonlinear logic of strategy takes over. Nor are strategy and tactics strictly hierarchical, as proponents of the operational level of war claim. Rather, they exist in a dialectic relationship, a relationship broken by the insertion of the operational level of war. The result is an orphan concept shoehorned into a theory of war that neither requires it nor has room for it. Harold R. Winton, a professor at the U.S. Air Force School of Advanced Air and Space Studies, has written that military theory's first task is to define the field of study, and its second task is to categorize. The conflicting, confusing, and capricious concepts of an operational level of war failed this test, neither producing a solid definition of the field of study nor assisting in the categorization within that larger field. Indeed, they simply complicate categorization already accomplished. The operational art of war. A related but distinct concept to the operational level of war is operational art, which Soviet military thinkers did pioneer. Despite their distinction, the terms are frequently used interchangeably. Milan Vigo describes operational art as a component of military art concerned with the theory and practice of planning, preparing, conducting, and sustaining campaigns and major operations aimed at accomplishing strategic or operational objectives in a given theater. This is a bit of a circular definition, and Vigo also uses operational art as synonymous with the operational level of war. Yet the focus on planning, preparation, conducting, and sustaining military actions is compelling, and these activities are distinct from both tactics and strategy. Vigo is not alone in this view. Shimon Neve, an influential proponent of the operational level of war, has written, "The essence of this level is the preparation, planning, and conduct of military operations." Operational art has more in common with what Clausewitz referred to as preparations for war, which is distinct from the conduct thereof, which is the realm of tactics and strategy. We can better ascertain the place of operational art if it is disconnected with the operational level. Removing operational art from the requirements of its own level, which would require their own logic, allows us to ground it in something besides the vague linking of tactics and strategy, and retain it as a descriptor of planning, preparing, conducting, and sustaining military operations. It still requires a foundation in tactics and still requires a connection to strategy, but it no longer encroaches on or interposes itself between them. Operational art, then, is the planning, preparation, synchronization, and sustainment of tactics over a sustained period of time, a large geographic expanse, or both. The linear logic of tactics remains the same, victory in combat, as does the non-linear logic of strategy, using combat results to secure an advantageous peace. Operational art comprises the disciplines required to place military forces in an advantageous position to employ tactics to achieve strategic effect. Because it remains tied by tactical tenets to achieve that advantage, yet beholden to strategy to give it direction, it exhibits no logic of its own. Operational art is a supporting effort to both. Pushback against the operational level. Of course, the widespread acceptance of the operational level of war is not total. The concept and its proponents have their opponents. In 2009, Justin Kelly and Mike Brennan wrote a report for the U.S. Army Strategic Studies Institute titled Alien: How Operational Art Devoured Strategy. It was an inauspicious time for American strategy. The previous presidential administration had mired the country in two strategically aimless quagmires. A new administration would involve it in yet more of the same. The operational level of war as a doctrinal concept was in constant practice, and it was uniformly failing. The U.S. military, far from exhibiting the mastery of a link between tactics and strategy, was instead clearly and painfully adrift. Kelly and Brennan conclude that when the Soviet concept of an operational level of war was copied into U.S. Army doctrine without the historical or doctrinal context, it severed campaign planning from the concept of strategy. This produced an American conception of war that magnified the importance of campaigns and tactics while minimizing the importance of strategy. Decades of intellectual effort to ascertain the connection between tactics and strategy, from Clausewitz on, were simply jettisoned. Another commentator, William F. Owen, also strongly disagrees with the concept of the operational level of war. He makes a similar argument, agreeing that the operational level not only undermines strategy, but also in so doing marginalizes tactics. The idea of the operational level as a link between the two also falls flat. Tactics and strategy are inextricably linked already, having been understood as such for centuries. Owen goes on to argue, convincingly, that the adoption of the operational level of war has led to a poor understanding of tactics in Western militaries, reflected in turn in the practice of bad tactics on the battlefield. Still, another critique is the inconsistent definition of the operational level of war. This is found in U.S. Army doctrine itself, as will be seen. Sir Hugh Strachan, a British military historian, has also found this problematic, describing how the operational level has described strategy at some times and tactics at others, never finding its own purchase. He writes, "Operational art has been stretched hither and yon because it is not contained by a sure grasp of the relationship between war and policy, and by proper structures to debate and guide strategy." To be fair, he goes on to write that, once they exist, operational art and the operational level of war will rediscover both their true purpose and their proper place. An equally likely outcome, however, is that the operational level of war will discover that it has no place. A sure grasp of war and policy and the tactics that underpin them has no need for it. Nor is this limited to American doctrine. Major Will Viggers of the Australian Defence Force has also written about how his country's doctrine struggles to explain coherently the rationale for these levels, as their conceptions are confused and blurred. This confusion is worldwide. Strategic theorist Colin S. Gray has also written about the operational level. He defines operations as combinations of purposefully linked military engagements, generally though not necessarily on a large scale. Operations are strategy as action. Gray also warns that the interpolation of an operational level of war between strategy and tactics, far from being a link, may more often than not be a barrier between the two, or worse, an excuse to ignore one or the other. For him, operations are about the orchestration of military action, or tactics. Orchestration is less of a level than an independent act of arranging. A symphony also requires orchestration of various groups of instruments, but the principles of musical theory, rhythm, melody, chords, and harmony among others, do not change in the act. Gray's vision of operations, then, is closer to operational art than to the operational level. The concept of an operational level of war is failing also in practice, not just in theory. Jonathan Schroden has written about how U.S. policymakers are increasingly turning to special operations forces to bypass the operational level of war and connect tactical actions by small groups of military individuals direct to strategic aims. This is a recognition by national leadership that tactical action and strategic effects must be linked and that conventional forces have lost the know-how required for this. Both the concept of an operational level and the bureaucracy that has accreted around it have disabled American strategy to the point where a large portion of the U.S. military forces, those that are thought to work on the operational level, are viewed as ineffective, placing more and more of a burden on a small number of special operators. These critics, theorists, analysts, and others have warned about the deleterious effects of the concept of the operational level of war. This is not, however, just an exercise in academic debate. War is a human phenomenon, executed by real people. Conducting it on the basis of erroneous assumptions and concept is just as much a threat to their lives as the actions of the enemy force they encounter. Understanding the operational level of war and operational art, therefore, is not pure pedantry and sophistry. It has real implications in real-world engagements, both for policymakers and for military personnel. Conclusion. The conventional wisdom regarding the operational level of war is that it was created either by the Germans or the Soviets in response to the increasing complexity, scope, and...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?